everyone. Good morning. My name's Shailee. Thanks very much for joining this morning's In-House in Focus. You will see my QR code there up on the slide, so do feel free to scan that, and that will take you to my LinkedIn profile, and we can connect and sort of keep you up to date on new updates in procurement law. So I'm Shailee. I am a public procurement lawyer at Wilson Reeve. My experience is helping public authorities and utilities plan and run public procurement exercises, and I also advise bidders through the process and also help them assert their rights if they think there's been a breach of the rules. So a couple of points of housekeeping before we start. The session is being recorded, and you'll receive a recording and a copy of the materials later. You'll notice the question and answer box. Do please use that for any questions. It's only me that can see those. If you run out of time, if you make sure your name is in the question, and I'll be able to follow up with you later. And finally, there is an opportunity to provide feedback as well at the end of the session, which will take a few minutes. Any feedback you have on today's session and any suggestions you've got for any future topics are always gratefully received. So what are we going to cover today? So today's session is all about public procurement law and what the public procurement landscape looks like in 2021. Following the UK's exit from the EU. It's been a really interesting time for public procurement lawyers. We've got the combined impact of the pandemic and Brexit. I think it's safe to say that procurement has never been in the headlines quite as much as it has done over the last 12 months or so. Alongside the changes that have been brought about by Brexit, the government has also published a number of procurement policy notes, or PPPNs, at the start of this year and at the end of last year, and these have an impact on how procurements are run, so I'll go through those in turn. The slide contains links to each of the PPPNs, so you're able to read them at leisure. So let's start with Brexit-related changes. So the first thing to note is you've got the snappily titled Public Procurement Amendments, etc. EU Exit Regulations 2020, and they amend the 2015 regulations. So you don't have to refer to a new set of regulations. The key piece of legislation is still the Public Contracts Regulations 2015. Now, in general, there hasn't been any significant change to the public procurement regime. It still applies to all the same kinds of contracting authorities, and the procedures and all the associated timescales are all the same. A summary of the changes are on the slide. You'll be familiar with the term OJU, which we all now have to sort of retrain ourselves not to say, and that's the official journal of the EU, and that's where notices were published pre-Brexit. We've now got Find a Tender, which I'll talk about shortly. Another thing to note is that the threshold levels are now expressly set out in the regulations. Usually there was, or pre-Brexit, they referred out to a commission statement, but now they are sort of enshrined within the legislation. They'll next be updated in January 2022. It still won't be a round number because it's a conversion from the World Trade Organization's government procurement agreement, which the UK is now party to. Other changes involve the transfer of the Commission functions to the Cabinet Office and replacing references to EU law with the UK law equivalents, and that's particularly relevant for the references to social, environmental and labour law. Another key point to note is that the grounds for exclusion in Regulation 57, so as part of your selection process, the mandatory clause have been updated. So if you've got a template SQ, you may want to update it. So the most significant change is that we now have a UK-based e-notification service called Find a Tender, which is sort of commonly being abbreviated to FTS. And that's where notices for new procurement should be published instead of in the official journal. And the Cabinet Office published PPPN 8 in November last year, all about the new system. One of the questions we've been asked is, well, where do we need to publish notices now if we've got a procurement that was published in the official journal? Well, the answer to that is that if you've launched a procurement but not yet finalised it, a tender under the old regime, then you must continue to publish notices in the official journal. And a procurement is deemed to have been launched where a call for competition has been published, for example, a contract notice, or if you're using a prior information notice of the call for competition, then that is enough to have launched your procurement. And a procurement is finalised where a contract award notice has been published. And if a notice isn't required, then it's when the contract was entered into. And if there was a decision not to award the contract, then a procurement is finalised when bidders were informed of the reasons why the contract wasn't awarded. So, for example, if you issue a contract notice that was published in the official journal, then the contract award notice should also be published in the official journal. And this is all sort of also important to bidders as well, who will need to make sure that they're looking in the right place for notices. So we need to keep an eye on both the official journal for notices that setting out where when contracts have been awarded, and FTS in relation to new contract opportunities. So this next slide sets out a summary of the publication requirements. The PPN also includes a flowchart, which is designed to help you identify where you need to publish a notice. A couple of things to note. When you're calling off from existing framework agreements or dynamic purchasing systems that were awarded before 31st of December, you should publish future notices on the official journal. Note that there is no obligation to publish a contract award notice when you're calling off from a framework. The PPN actually recommends that you replicate notices on FTS, but that's not an absolute obligation. One of the questions we've been asked is whether there have been any changes to the requirement to publish on Contracts Finder. So that's the UK portal for publishing national notices for contracts above either £10,000 or £25,000. The answer to that is no. No changes at all to the Contracts Finder regime. You must still publish notices on Contracts Finder where required. So a couple of things to consider when you're using FTS. So as far as we're aware, the UK hasn't published template notices in the same way that you can see template notices on the EU website. FTS notices are split into three categories. You've got future opportunities, and awarded contracts. There are also other types of notices available, like changes to notices and also VEET notices. You need to check that your third-party provider has integrated with FTS, even though we're sort of a couple of months in. I know that some clients of ours have been having some issues with their third-party provider. The FAQs to the PPN contains a list of providers that have confirmed that they are ready for the new system. And if your system isn't compatible with FTS, then you are able to register directly with the FTS service. The PPN says that if you have to post notices to OJU rather, you are also asked to include them on FTS, but note that it's the obligation to post on OJU that comes first. That might be something that you want to have a policy on. it might be better from a risk mitigation perspective to duplicate notices, both in the official journal and on FTS. So that's about as much as we know about FTS at the moment. How can you best prepare? So if you're an authority, firstly ensure that you're either registered with FTS or your e-tendering provider has properly set itself up to publish notices in the right place. Consider whether you've got any live framework agreements or dynamic purchasing systems that require notices to be published in the official journal. I think some clients are publishing on both platforms as a matter of policy. Consider whether that's something you'd like to do. And finally, review any template selection questionnaires that you have to ensure that it reflects the most up-to-date position in the regulations. And what if you're a bidder? You don't need to worry about sort of all the details of the background of the notices, but and I think it's fair to say that the process hasn't really changed if you're responding to a bidding opportunity as far as Brexit goes. However, the government has published some guidance on bidding for opportunities overseas. So as it says on the slide, the UK is now a member of the government procurement agreement in its own right. It was always a member by virtue of its membership to the European Union, but we are now a standalone party. And what that means is that UK business can still bid for procurement opportunities covered by the GPA in other parties' countries, and vice versa. So bidders from other parties to the GPA can participate in procurements conducted here. Before I move on to the PPNs, I'm just going to have a look, see what questions we've got. What happens about the provisions of the directive that weren't transcribed into the regs? I'm thinking of the right to award a call-off that is no longer than a framework, for example. Can we use that as guidance? Yes, so I suppose the answer to that is yes. So all the guidance that was provided pre-Brexit in relation to whether a call-off contract can go on beyond the length of the framework agreement, that all still stands. That's actually also confirmed in CCS guidance as well on framework agreements. I think it's now accepted that it is possible to have a call-off contract that goes on beyond the scope of the framework. Okay, I think I'll move on now from FTS to other policy procurement notes. So starting with the most recent first, PPN 121 was published last week. And that applies to all contracting authorities. And what it does is discusses the options available where an authority needs to procure something in an emergency. So about this time last year, the Cabinet Office issued PPN 120, and that was all to do with responding to COVID and set out options available, most notably when you want to directly award a contract due to extreme urgency. I think since then it's clear from sort of all the headlines and litigation facing the government that the government has directly awarded a number of contracts citing extreme urgency during the course of the pandemic. And what the PPN does is really recognise and articulate the risks around directly awarding contracts in an emergency situation, most notably poor value for money. And what the PPN does is remind authorities that there are other options available which should be considered before directly awarding a contract, and also reminds authorities that a proper and timely record should be kept of all decisions made. And as I said earlier, there is this obligation to publish notices, and those should go on FTS and Contracts Finder where required. Next, we've got PPN 6 on social value. So this applies to central government departments, executive agencies and non-departmental public bodies from the 1st of January, but is really likely to be of relevance to other authorities as well. And what the PPN does is set out a social value model to be applied in a procurement where social value is relevant and proportionate to the subject matter of the contract. Before this PPN, there was an obligation under the Public Services Social Value Act of 2012 to consider evaluating social value when you are procuring services, and this PPN goes much further and makes application of the social value model mandatory. And what the PPN does, it's really useful. And there's a sort of handful of PDFs. It sets out a list of themes and outcomes to apply when you're running a procurement. So a couple of examples, how your contract can help local communities manage and recover from the impact and continuing impact of COVID-19. And this can be demonstrated by offering solutions that create employment, retraining opportunities for those that have been left unemployed by the pandemic, or things like thinking about improving workplace conditions. So things like demonstrating effective social distancing and remote working solutions. So those are the sorts of things that you can include within your procurement. Other policy outcomes are fighting climate change, addressing workforce inequality, and improving health and well-being. So the social value model mandates a minimum 10% weighting to the evaluation of social value in the procurement, and that's 10% of the overall score and not 10% within the quality criteria. It's open to authorities to apply a higher weighting if they can justify it. And as with all evaluation weightings, it's important that the authority stress tests the evaluation methodology to ensure that the relative weightings given to each criterion don't lead to any sort of unintended consequences. The PPN also sets out model evaluation questions, model criteria and reporting metrics for each of the policy outcomes. So altogether really useful tools if you're considering how to meaningfully evaluate social value in your procurements. There's lots more I could say about social value, and there's a lot more we can say about the next PPN 2, which is PPN 9 that was published in December. PPN 9 launches the construction playbook, which sets out 14 key policies on how to assess, procure and deliver public works programmes. It's the result of collaboration across the public and the private sector, and it pulls together best practice in order to bring about efficiency to the procurement of infrastructure projects. It aligns to the outsourcing playbook, which was first published in February 19 and then was updated in June of last year, but is more specific to sort of infrastructure projects and the particular challenges faced in those sorts of contracts. Lots of really useful guidance on the procurement life cycle in there. It's split into 5 stages, so it takes you from preparation and planning to publication of your opportunity, how to select the right bidders, how to come up with your shortlist, how to evaluate an award, and then finally contract implementation. We've got another session specifically on the construction playbook on the 4th of March at 4 o'clock, if you don't mind me just putting a cheeky plug for that. We'll be talking about the application of the playbook in a bit more detail with some of my colleagues in the construction team, so look out for that on our events page. Next, we've got PPN 11. Again, this applies to central government departments, executive agencies and DPBs from the 1st of January. But the PPN says that other authorities are encouraged to apply the principles of the guidance. And what this PPN does is effectively allow authorities to reserve procurements that are below threshold by supplier location. So you can specify that only suppliers in certain geographical areas can bid. You've only got two options for this. You can either specify that bids are invited on a UK-wide basis or by county. It is also possible to limit your competition to SMEs or VCSEs. The PPN states that this policy can be used to help authorities tackle things like economic inequality, create new businesses or jobs, or encouraging new entrants to government markets. So remember that this isn't an absolute obligation to always reserve below threshold contracts, and you've still got to consider what option gives you best value for money on a case-by-case basis before you decide to limit the scope of any procurement. And you've also still got to comply with your own internal guidance and governance. Again, procurement law loves an audit trail, and that remains key. There's a template document contained within the PPN to help authorities record their rationale for reserving procurements. Note that there is still an obligation to publish notices on Contracts Finder for contracts above £10,000 if you're a central government authority, an executive agency or an NDPB. And even if you are limiting the scope of the procurement, you need to make clear in your notice that that's what you're doing. The next one is PPN 7, and that is something that's coming up in the next couple of months. So we'll start applying from April 2021, and it will apply to contracts with an annual contract value of £5 million and above, and again, one for central government executive agencies and NDPBs. And what this PPN does is introduce a new standard question to be included with the selection questionnaire, assessing bidders' payment systems and payment performance. The policy is designed to implement the government's objective of encouraging a healthy cash flow by mandating prompt payment throughout the supply chain. So what bidders will have to do from April is certify that they meet the required standards, which will be evaluated on a pass-fail basis. So there'll be a new question within the SQ that says, are you paying your suppliers in accordance with your contractual terms, yes or no? Are you paying 95% of your invoices within 60 days, yes or no? And then that's to be evaluated on a pass-fail basis. I think that the word on the street is that the Cabinet Office is preparing a new updated standard selection questionnaire. I think it's been promised for some time. We're hopeful that we'll get it soon, and it will incorporate this PPN to make it clear when you need to, or remind authorities rather, that they need to include it if the contract is covered. I'll just stop there for a couple more questions. So one about the social value PPN. So will the 10% weighting for social value only be applicable to central government agencies and not local authorities? The answer to that is yes. The PPN only applies to those bodies mentioned. If you are wanting to benefit from the hard work that's captured within the social value model and use those questions, you are open to do so. And it is open to you to apply a lesser weighting. I suppose, as with the application of any evaluation criteria, you want to make sure that it reflects the actual makeup of the contract and sort of makes a difference, as it were, in your scoring. So that stress testing is really important to make sure that you are incentivizing bidders to really put forward meaningful solutions in terms of social value. Another question, is there a service that you can sign up to be notified each time a new PPN is published? I wish there was, but what I do is I've got it bookmarked. It shows how sad I am. I have the PPN bookmark, a homepage bookmarked, and I sort of check on it every couple of days just to keep an eye out. But I don't think there's anything more technical than that, I'm afraid. So I just wanted to mention, I think we're doing well for time. Before I finish, a couple of resources that Mills and Reeve offer. The first is the procurement portal. So that's a free to access resource. It's got a blog on it with lots of updates, including updates to the PPNs when they're published. And you can subscribe for updates to that. There's also a glossary for all the procurement related jargon that we all come across. Lots of resources, template documents and a toolkit, so well worth a look. There's also one of the most popular pages across the Mills and Reeve webpage, the standstill calculator, and what that does is help you calculate your standstill period correctly. We also have regulation 84.co.uk, and that's a free tool designed to help you create compliant regulation 84 reports. So we've talked a little bit about the audit trail today, and there's a specific obligation in the regulations to capture your procurement decision making within something called a regulation 84 report. And what this website does is create a checklist with all the mandatory parts and helps you compile a compliant report. I think we're done with questions actually, so that's all I was going to say. Just a flag of another session in a couple of weeks' time. My colleagues Neil Smith and Morgan Bowen are looking at what you should practically and legally do if a business that you're contracting with goes into an insolvency process, and how you can best protect yourselves from that. And you can register for that on our website. So that's everything from me. Thanks very much for joining and thank you for your questions. If you have a couple of moments to complete the feedback before you go, that would be great. And if you have any other questions, please do get in touch. Thanks very much.